Just bear with me one moment while I get my PowerPoint on this computer. I haven't actually copied it up. Here we go. Yes. Okay, thank you all for coming out tonight. I'd like to thank Reasons to Believe and the UBC Freethinkers Club for organizing this discussion between Fazale Rana and myself on the all-important topic of morality. In many ways, I think that morality is a more relevant conversation to be having than the more frequent clashes we see between science and religion, because I think in many cases it's really an anxiety about science leading people away from religion, which people believe, religious people believe, is the foundation for morality, that motivates those science versus religion sort of conversations in the first place. So I think this is actually a very important conversation to be having. So one clarification I think to make at the outset is we're not talking about, Fuzz and I are not talking about whether people can be good without God. I think we can all see that atheists are as good and as bad in practice as religious people. Some of the most secular countries in the world are the most happy and healthy and functional, and some of the most religious places in the world are some of the most unhappy and dysfunctional. So I don't think that's the interesting question. I think the interesting question is whether ethical judgments can be fully justified if there is no God. And this is, I think, the conversation that Dr. Rana and I should be having. There's that should already. So that's the question that I'm going to be looking at. So this is sort of an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. First, we're going to examine what we even mean when we talk about morality, which is a question that Dr. Rana started with. And specifically, I'm going to be suggesting that there are two fundamental ways of understanding morality: the descriptive definition and the prescriptive definition. I'll explain what that means in a second. Secondly, I'm going to be looking at the relationship between God and morality and whether God does, in fact, provide an objective basis for morality. I think it'll be more appropriate to address Dr. Rana's points in the rebuttal. And then thirdly, I'm going to be taking a look at how we can give an objective foundation to morality through appealing to human values alone, without requiring God. So I'm going to be using the word ethics a lot in this conversation, and you might be wondering, what's the difference between ethics and morality? Are they just synonymous? Well, not really. Ethics, you could say, is the study of morality, or the attempt to understand morality. So that's all I want to say about the difference there. So this is an important point, not just for the definition of morality. What do we mean when we use the word morality? It's an important question to ask, not just for examining the consequences of the beliefs that we have about what morality means, but for the sake of having an engaging conversation where we're not just talking past one another. And there are fundamentally two ways of understanding morality. There's the descriptive definition of morality, which says that morality is just what people believe to be good or bad. So it's just literally like, you might find that your neighbor has stolen your newspaper, and you ask that neighbor, why did you steal my newspaper? And he says, hey, I don't believe it's wrong to steal newspapers. The descriptive definition of morality would just sort of have you write that down, and that's what your neighbor believes. But I think the more important and the more difficult definition of morality is the normative or prescriptive definition of morality, which refers to the code of conduct that we should abide by if we were being fully rational. And this definition of morality prescribed behavior tells us what we should do rather than merely reporting what we actually do. So why is this important? Why is this distinction important? There are very telling consequences that result from conflating these two definitions of morality, which has happened throughout the history of philosophy. For example, if we believe that prescriptive and descriptive definitions of morality are one and the same thing, we might conclude that since everybody disagrees on what is right or wrong, so there's no objective morality out there in the world. Like, that's sort of the route that nihilists go, right? Or subjectivists or emotivists. These are all philosophical jargon that you guys might not know about, but it's like people who believe there's no objective right or wrong, they start from this conflation of concepts. Or other people who believe that, stealing is fine since people have done it throughout history. That's based on that same confusion. And the attempt to resolve ethical disputes without reference to human values is the consequence of that same confusion. And I think this is really where God comes in. So just a quick sort of an aside, because I am going to be focusing mostly on philosophy. It's important to notice that imperatives are statements about what we should do. They're not justified or refuted by observing the biological or historical origin of our moral feelings. And the reason for that is, this is a very common way of speaking, right? So we say things like, my desire to do X, Y, or Z is natural, so why are you telling me it's right, or why are you telling me it's wrong? But many of our biologically determined tendencies are immoral. For example, some people are born sociopaths. Some people are born... anthropologists are telling us that the human species has a tendency to genocide because it was successful in our ancestors' past. Would have meant that certain groups would have survived when others wouldn't have. Violence is another tendency that may be natural to us. That's not helping us today. On the other hand, conversely, some moral acts actually decrease our fitness, and those are some of the moral acts that we regard as the most profound and the most meaningful. Like, for example, when we self-sacrifice, when we give our lives, our livelihood to help other people. A biologist, a game theoretician maybe, would look at that and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. You're decreasing your fitness, you're reducing the frequency of your genes in the gene pool. But that's not the point of morality. So this is sort of an aside that I wanted to point out. And another aside here is that biology constrains our ethical imperatives. So we can't be told to fly because we can't fly, and we can't be told to hate people whom we love because that contradicts our psychology. I think this point will come up more in the rebuttal than here, but these are sort of asides. So now let's turn to what God's relationship is to morality. What are the ways of conceiving God as being related to morality? Since fact and value are divided, maybe God can provide us the bridge over which we can find moral values. And this is sort of what Dr. Rana has been suggesting tonight. But straight away we come into a classical philosophical problem called, traditionally, the Euthyphro Dilemma, but that's sort of an old name for a very common, lasting problem. And here's the basic notion. There's two ways of conceiving of God and in relation to morality. It could be that God's relation to morality is one of like a beneficent father figure who tells you, actually that's going to be my next one. It's going to be like, maybe Faz can relate to this in like the Middle Eastern father figure that requires that you obey him because he told you something. And he needs you to do it because, well, he's the father. He raised you, he paid for your education, he gave you a place to live. So you need to obey him. And this is the idea of God as the lawgiver. God says something, therefore it's moral. God forbids something, therefore it's immoral. But the problem with this is that it seems to render morality arbitrary. It seems like, at this point, if this is true, then God really could have said that anything is moral. If God had wanted to, God could have programmed us to believe that rape was fine, or could have programmed us to think theft was fine. Anything could have been moral in this way, the image of God. The second one is the idea of God as a beneficent father figure. In this way of looking at God, oh, by the way, I think Gary Larson did a really good job of illustrating God. That's why I go with the far side comment. In this way of viewing God, God warns us about right or wrong beforehand, before we actually have to learn it for ourselves. And I think that this is a coherent way of thinking about an anthropomorphic sort of God. But the problem with this is, from the theist point of view, is that it actually divorces God from morality, in the sense that it's not the fact that God said it that makes it true. It's just that God is telling us what is true for independent reasons. The truth of morality resides outside of God, so to speak. So theologians have tried to resolve this dilemma, and Thomas Aquinas was the first one to put forward an alternative, and theologians like Dr. William Lane Craig have advanced this as well, which is to say that, well, it's not really either of the first two alternatives. It's more like God examines his own nature and sees that it's good and prescribes according to his nature. So in this way of looking at God, it's not that God could tell us, that rape is okay if he wanted to, because that would contradict God's own nature. But at the same time, the wrongness of rape is a reflection of something about God. But the problem with this is that, although on the surface it seems somehow coherent, it's really because it relies on an intuitive understanding of morality that I'm going to be exposing or elucidating later, and is actually circularly defining goodness as God's nature, and then God's nature as essentially goodness. And so we don't actually get an understanding of what morality means in this way of thinking. And so the conclusion I think we're forced to is that God does not ground morality in any objective way. Either God arbitrarily chooses what's right or wrong, or morality is independent of God. I think this is the dilemma that we're fundamentally faced with. And so given that this is the case, it seems to me that either the theist and the non-theist are both on the same footing with respect to the mystery of morality, or morality has a rational basis without appeal to God, because God can't give it a rational basis. So I'm going to be suggesting that there is, in fact, a rational basis to morality independent of God, which is specifically that the rightness and wrongness of actions arises from the attempt to reconcile human interests. So the way that this works, the way that philosophers have sort of realized that we arrive at moral conclusions or conclusions about what we should do is we start with certain what we call prima facie or surface duties. So it seems like, for example, it seems intuitively correct that we should prevent unnecessary suffering. It would be strange to invoke God to justify the imperative to prevent unnecessary suffering, or the imperative to fulfill promises, or correct a previous wrongdoing. From these prima facie duties, we arrive at certain ethical theories that capture those duties and explain them. And there's sort of what we have observed to be a two-way relationship between our ethical conclusions and our ethical theories. So our theories inform or constrain our judgments, and our judgments inform our theories. And this has a remarkable similarity to the way that we do science. A lot of people think that science proceeds sort of like just by making observations, and then you form your hypothesis, and then you have a theory. But in reality, the way that science works is a much more dynamic process in which the interpretation we have of our observations is dependent on the theory-latedness with which we make those observations. Like, for example, the physicists who observed the evidences for the constancy of the speed of light at the turn of the century interpreted it in ways that Einstein later overturned through a new theory. And so this two-wayness about ethical theory and judgments is really not a problem in the sense of being somehow